Awesome. Well, welcome to EcoNema Talks. I am Colleen Young, and I'm an interviewer for EcoNema. And I received my PhD in biological anthropology from the University of Missouri with a specialization in evolutionary biology and island evolution. I was trained as an undergraduate in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, where I worked in osteology and biodiversity labs and graduated with honors after completing a thesis that explored changes in bird diversity on the Channel Islands during the Holocene, relating to human subsistence practices via zooarchaeological analysis. As a graduate student at the University of Missouri, I received the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship and pursued research in Baja California, Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Channel Islands to understand the interplay among body size and shape in insular ecologies. I currently am a data scientist, a drummer, and an adjunct professor at the University of Utah. We are thrilled to have here with us today Dr. Tim Ingold. He's an emeritus professor of social anthropology at the University of Aberdeen and a fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He was formerly at the University of Manchester as a Max Gluckman professor in the Department of Anthropology. His research has involved ethnographic fieldwork among the Sami and Finnish people in Lapland. He has written on comparative questions of environment, technology, and social organization in the circumpolar north, as well as on the role of animals in human society, on issues in human ecology, and on evolutionary theory in anthropology, biology, and history. He has explored the links between environmental perception and skilled practice, with a view to replacing traditional models of genetic and cultural transmission with a relational approach focusing on the growth of embodied skills of perception and action within social and environmental contexts of development. He has subsequently taught and written on a series of issues on the interface between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture. Thank you so much for having us this time today, Tim, and we look forward to exploring more of some questions with you. The first question that we have, so beyond the academic introduction that I have just made, we would like to get to know Tim Ingold a little bit more personally in private. And so do you have any comments beyond what I just made in terms of who you are? What has your history been like in the general context by which you have become who you are now?
Okay, well, I'm the son of an academic middle class academic family in southern Britain. So my father worked when I was young. My father was working at the University of London. He was a professor of botany, and his specialism was mycology, the study of fungi. So I grew up in a household in which my dad was always looking at fungi under a microscope on our dining room table, and students would sometimes come for forays out in the countryside, and I would go along too. So that was a sort of very rather scientific milieu in which I grew up. And I always used to say to my dad, who never understood what anthropology was, that actually anthropology is for the social sciences what mycology is for the botanical sciences. I mean, in botany, fungi don't behave as organisms are supposed to behave. They get all over the place. They form all sorts of complicated networks or meshworks, and they're just not like standard organisms. And I try to explain that what I'm trying to do in anthropology is think about people in much the same way as he would think about organisms, a kind of fungal way. Anyway, so it was assumed that I would become a scientist. I did quite well at science and maths at school, and I had to take, as you have in the UK, you take what are called advanced level exams, which give you entry qualifications to university. So I took exams in maths, physics, and chemistry, and went up to Cambridge to study natural sciences. But then after a year of that, that's when I decided to change and to do anthropology instead. And I think I'm going to come to that as another question. But that's the background I come from.
Excellent. And did you grow up in, sorry if I missed this, did you grow up in Canada? Because I know you,
No, no, no. I grew up in I grew up in Kent. That's the southeasternmost county of England.
okay.
At least that's where I was born and first went to school. Then I was actually sent to a boarding school in Reading, which is about 30 miles west of London. Then I went to Cambridge, um, so that when I got my first proper job in Manchester, it was the first time I'd ever been to the northern part of England. It was like a foreign country to me at that stage. Yeah.
Hmm. Awesome. So you touched on it a little bit already, but and so you talked a little bit about in terms of your influence from fungi and your father, but can you expand a little bit more on how you developed an interest, and then not only just an interest in anthropology, but pursued it to the extent that you became an emeritus professor of anthropology?
Well, what happened was that I went to Cambridge with the intention of doing the tripos in natural sciences. And I remember in my first year, I did courses on mathematics, physics, a course called the crystalline state, and one on cell biology. And when I'd studied science at school, I had an inspirational teacher who really made you feel that you were sitting on the edge of the universe, confronting these wonderful, fabulous questions. And I went up to university, and the teaching was awful. That you'd have these Nobel Prize winners who'd stand with their back to a large class, write things on the blackboard that you then had to copy down. And I felt I wasn't really against science, but I just felt that science was that there was no room to breathe in it, that it was very claustrophobic, it was dominated, it was very hierarchical, dominated by important men. And I wanted a subject. I felt that in science you could be no more than a little cog in this huge machine. It was also the time of the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of protests about science's complicity in the military-industrial complex, but I don't think I wasn't particularly politicized in that respect. But I just felt that there was no room to breathe in science, and I wanted to find a discipline kind of which was in the same state that physics was in at the time of Galileo. I wanted to be the Galileo of I wanted to find a discipline where I could really make a difference. And at the time, I was really concerned about the division between the natural sciences and the humanities, and felt that there was something wrong about this. So I was looking for a subject that would somehow overcome that difference, but at the same time stay close to real life. And I looked through all the things you could study at the University of Cambridge at that time, and I came across two that might fit the bill, that would somehow bridge the gap between sciences and humanities and somehow stay close to life. And one was the history and philosophy of science, and the other was anthropology. And my dad knew one or two anthropologists from the University of London, so he fixed me up so I could talk to them. One of them was a very prominent anthropologist at the London School of Economics called Jean Lafontaine. She was then a youngish lecturer. I went to talk to her, and she told me to read a book by Frederick Bath called Political Leadership Among Swat Pathans, which happened to be a classic of anthropology at the time. And I read this book and was completely bowled over by it. So I thought, that's it. So at that point, I went for anthropology rather than the history and philosophy of science. I have not regretted that. And the reasons I took it up then are still the reasons why I do it now. I see it as the one discipline that, well, there are two disciplines that really try to transcend the division between sciences and humanities, and one is philosophy and the other is anthropology. But the difference is that anthropology tries to build that bridge through conversations with and learning from people around the world, rather than just doing it all in an ivory tower by reading the canonical texts in the discipline. So I still see anthropology as a kind of philosophical inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of human life, but it's an inquiry we do not through engagements with the works of dead white men in the philosophical tradition from Aristotle onwards, but through engagements with people anywhere, everywhere, in the course of their everyday lives. And that's what I think is special to anthropology, and why I still do it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's funny. That passion that anthropologists have, it's I think unique. I mean, of course, there's passions amongst other like scientists, et cetera, but there's something unique about anthropologists in terms of how they got into the discipline and how they kept going with it. And yeah,
it's a vocation. I mean, perhaps rather like if you feel that you're called to the church as a theologian, or called to the hospital as a doctor. I mean, it's something that you do because you feel you have this calling to do it.
Yeah. So continuing on with this concept of anthropology, right? That's why we're here. How would you define anthropology?
I've got a short definition and a long one. The short definition, which I came up with around about 1990 or early 1990s, in a conversation with a colleague, and it just came out. And that short definition is that anthropology is philosophy with the people in, which kind of follows from what I was just saying, that the questions that we ask, questions about how people know, learn, remember, find their way about, organize themselves into societies, exercise power, deal with death, confront illness, and so on. These are all philosophical questions, but we address these questions by bringing in people, bringing people into the conversation around these questions. It can be any people, anywhere, but that's what. So although anthropology is addressing philosophical questions, it's addressing them in a way that brings people generally into the conversation rather than keeping them out. So philosophy with the people in is my short definition. My long definition, here goes, is that anthropology is a generous, open-ended, comparative and yet critical inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of being in the one world we all inhabit. So that's a long definition, and every word in that definition has an important place. So anthropology is generous because we don't extract information by force or by deceit, as many other disciplines do. We're not trying to elicit things. We take what is offered in good grace and listen to it and respond to it. So that's the first thing. Generosity means that we actually pay attention to what other people have to say and receive with good grace what is offered, rather than taking what is not. The second thing, open-endedness, is that we are not looking for final solutions. I mean, final solutions have generally been disastrous for humans. It's a inquiry that continually carries on, just as social life carries on. It's not moving towards some kind of final end state. There are no final answers to our questions. We have to just keep on asking them. It's comparative because we can never assume of any way of doing things that it's the only way. So that whenever we see people doing this or that, or whenever they say one thing rather than another, we're always asking ourselves, well, this is all very interesting, but why are they doing them this way rather than that other way? So we're always looking over our shoulder and saying, yes, people here, this is what they think and this is what they do, but over there, people are doing something different. So why this way rather than that? And that's the sort of basic comparative attitude that is sort of factored in to the way anthropologists work. That's the comparative, and it's critical because we can't obviously be content with the way things are. I mean, everybody recognizes that the current systems of production, distribution, governance have driven the world onto the brink of catastrophe, and we need all the help we can get in trying to sort things out. So we have to be critical in the sense that rather than accepting things as they are, we have to speculate about possibilities of how things might be. So, and then lastly, that's the generous, open-ended, comparative, critical. And then there's also the bit, the one world we all inhabit. And this is terribly important for me, because I do think we do all inhabit one world. And I'm critical of those anthropologists who keep talking about many worlds. So there are lots and lots of different worlds. I think that's politically and ethically misguided. I think we do inhabit one world, and therefore every one of us bears a kind of responsibility towards it for what goes on in it. But of course, it's not the one world of British Airways or corporate finance or something like that. We have to think about oneness in a different way. And I'm thinking of the oneness of the world as a capacity for infinite differentiation. So this one world is not a sort of closed in. It's not rounded in and contained. It's continually proliferating, but it's one all the same. So it's many in one, if you like. So that's what the one world bit means. And there's my definition of anthropology.
That was awesome. Thank you. That was really beautiful. I wish I had you as a professor at some point. That would have been great. Do you ever feel like paralyzed almost in the sense of because as an anthropologist, you understand there are so many different ways to do something, and there's so many, like you said, the possibilities can be infinite. Do you ever feel sometimes paralyzed in your own life and like what to do with different either like social cues or social norms or anything like that?
Not really. I sometimes, like everybody else, I guess, I sometimes feel a sense of despair when you see stupidity and what collective stupidity can do, but usually stupidity comes from people just how to put it, when people instead of thinking and reflecting on what they're doing, simply fall back on what they think they all have in common to begin with. That's when the stupidity sets in. So that when I'm talking about difference, I want to say that it's actually difference that holds us all together. I mean, in a conversation, in a good conversation, it works because everybody's got some different experience to bring into it and something to contribute. To say, yeah, but look, what about this and this and this? And so everybody's feeding in to this conversation the different experiences that they've had, and in the course of that conversation, they're also developing as the particular people they are, so that difference and togetherness actually are like two sides of the same coin. As we go along together, we also differentiate ourselves from one another. And the opposite of that is when people take difference to mean division and assume that everybody is the same, that there's a fence. And on one side, everybody's on this side, like the same in this position. And on the other side, they're all the same in that position. And it's when difference becomes division that stupidity sets in. And you see that happening around the world today. particularly in different kind of populist movements and in some kinds of identity politics. And that certainly drives me to despair. And I think we really need anthropology to explain to people what difference is really about and how difference is not about division. Because I think anthropology is really about learning how to live together in difference. And I'm trying to get that. We need to get that message across. And at the moment, it's hitting up against a lot of resistance because of populism, because of identity politics and all the other stuff that's so familiar to us all. So that's why I think that anthropology really has a tremendously important public role to play, and it's not really doing it as well as it could at the moment.
So continuing on that point in terms of its public role, so knowing the historical context in which anthropology developed as a social discipline and how useful it was originally for colonialist or nationalist interests of some states, in the contemporary context and in a practical way, where do you think anthropology is most useful in social terms?
I mean, I don't see anthropology as something like this body of knowledge that can be used or applied, but it's certainly tremendously valuable, and the value lies, I think, precisely in the fact that, unlike scholarship in most other disciplines, anthropology does take what other people say seriously. This is the key thing. Suppose you were to compare us with the anthropology, say, with a discipline like psychology, how do they differ? Psychologists also study people, but by and large, with psychology, they're collecting data on people, whatever particular area they're studying. They're collecting the data in order to produce some sort of authoritative knowledge about them, about attitudes, or about how cognition works, or whatever they might be interested in. But basically, the people themselves are there as sources of data, which are then converted by the discipline into knowledge products. Where anthropology differs, I think, is that it's not treating people as sources of data. It's treating people as interlocutors, as colleagues, as people you can discuss with, on the same level, really, as the people in your own university, your colleagues or your students who you might have discussions with.
Great. Sorry about that.
Okay. So I'll kind of pick up where I left off. I think I was just saying that, I was comparing psychology and anthropology, and that with anthropology, when we're working with people, we treat those people as interlocutors, as colleagues, whom we're learning from and studying with, rather than simply collecting data about. Or at least I think that's how it should be. It might not be like that all the time in practice, but in my ideal anthropology, if anthropology was done as I would like it to be done, then we would be treating the whole world as a university and going to study with people in order to learn from their experience and from what they know, just as we would go to study with professors in a university, hoping that through that study, we are in a better place to address the questions we all face collectively in the world about how to live. And that's where I think anthropology is different and why it has a very important contribution to make. But it also relates to this issue about colonization and decolonization. I mean, everybody knows that anthropology's history is rooted in the history of colonialism, and we can't do anything about that. I mean, the past, that's happened in the past, and there's no way we can change that. But to my mind, the colonial structuring of knowledge is still deeply rooted in the structure of the academy, and because it's to preserve the walls of the academy that we separate out the kind of study that goes on within its walls from the kind of study that goes on outside its walls. And we say, oh, we do field work out there, but we're having seminars and conferences in here. And that kind of distinction upholds the boundary of academia and the idea of the academic world as a sort of intellectual colonizer of the rest of the world. And I think that the real task of anthropology is to break down that barrier, to recognize that that the world is our university, that we're studying, that all life is study in a way, and I don't think any other discipline is better placed to kind of reconfigure the academic world in that way. But what disturbs me is that very many anthropologists today who claim to be acting in support of or promoting decolonization still insist that what they're doing outside the university is ethnography and what they're doing inside is anthropology, that ethnography is the kind of study you do with these other people, where you collect the material in order to write it up in a process that they call anthropological knowledge production. And I think that resort to ethnography plus anthropological knowledge production actually perpetuates the colonial structure of the academy. And I get very annoyed by so many anthropologists who claim to be leading lights in decolonization and yet still go on and on about doing ethnography with people out there and engaging in anthropological knowledge production in here. And there is, I think, a kind of hypocrisy still at the heart of academic anthropology, and it's not being addressed properly.
I think you're totally right. And I think one of the tough things though, I think is like the language that we use, right? And so how do we because I role switch, right? Like when I'm in an academic setting, the language I use I feel like is very different than when I'm in a non-academic setting. And so like how do we like normalize more, or I guess, yeah, how do we develop a language that's like more fluid between the two realms, right?
That's right. It's a challenge. I mean, it's not as though we have the answers ready, but it's a challenge to work on, that we have to find a different way of speaking, and particularly a different way of writing, because writing is mostly what we do, a way of writing that breaks down this barrier, so you don't have the feeling that you write one way in academia and another way in kind of life outside. There shouldn't be this division. It's not healthy and it's not right. But we need to work hard to find ways of transcending it.
So we've been flowing really well through these questions. So
yeah, I haven't been keeping to your script very well.
No, you're doing great. It's funny because our next question essentially is about the separation between nature and culture. So traditional anthropology used to make more or less a forceful separation between nature and culture, as assuming that the definition of what is human passed through culture. However, when culture is probably only an extension of biology. In this sense, how does Tim Ingold view the link between nature and culture? And we'll start there. So how do you view the link between nature and culture?
Well, what I for a long time, I've just been trying to break down this boundary altogether and think that it doesn't actually make any sense. And when I first started writing about it in the early 1990s, I mean, questioning the nature-culture binary seemed very strange. It's now become mainstream in anthropology, um, and you almost say, oh, you know, we don't do nature-culture distinctions anymore, at least not in social cultural anthropology. They're still alive and well in biological anthropology, which I'm sure you know only too well. They're still talking about what's it, co-evolutionary models in which there are these twin tracks of inheritance, a genetic one and a cultural one. So biological anthropologists are still stuck in this nature culture, or this biology culture binary, whereas most social cultural anthropologists have kind of given it up and decided that that the whole thing is an invention of Western modernity, which in a sense I think it is. And my argument all along was that we need to look at everything from a developmental perspective, a perspective of ontogenesis. And I was particularly interested in the development in a human life cycle of everyday skills of doing this and that. Different sorts of craft skills of playing musical instruments, skills of being able to walk around, and I mean all the different life skills that we have. They're all things that undergo development in the course of a life. They grow in you. It's like the skill of walking for a baby. Baby is not born walking. It has to learn to walk, and it learns to walk in an environment with the assistance of the people around it. And it's the same for every other skill. So then I was arguing that, of course, people vary in their skills. And traditionally, those variations are what we would call cultural. It's cultural variations. Say people in different cultures walk in different ways, for example. We know that. But my argument was that these cultural differences are not superimposed upon a universal natural baseline. Rather, they are differences that emerge in the course of development as kids, for example, grow up in environments that differ in terms of what they afford, the kind of environment it is, the sorts of people there are, the animals that are there, and so on. So I wanted to argue that the variations that we used to call cultural are actually variations in skill, and skills are things that emerge within processes of development. And it makes absolutely no sense to ask, is this development biological or cultural? I mean, if you watch a baby learning to walk, you can't factor it out into one bit biology, one bit culture. It's simply a process that is going on, and it leads to all sorts of changes in the organism itself in terms of the capacities of movement, perception, and so on. And that's what we're interested in. So I wanted to get rid of the whole biology culture thing, and I talked instead about variations in the way in which human organisms develop within their environments. There's this strong focus on development rather than on inheritance, on passing down ready-made instructions or schemata or anything like that. And that's still my view, but it's now becoming almost sort of standard, orthodox to say in anthropology that the concept of nature is specifically a Western construct. It's a product of modernity, and anthropologists keep talking about in this society or that society they have nothing equivalent to our concept of nature, or indeed our concept of culture. And nature, that this idea of nature is existing somehow outside and outside the realms of humanity is a very peculiarly Western idea, but which is true. But I've now come to the view, so recently actually, that we need to hold on to the concept of nature, and but in the sense that it originally meant, because the word nature comes from the Latin natus, meaning to be born, and it actually refers to a power of generation, of birth. It's referring to the generative capacity of the world, the capacity of the world to give birth to new life. Just as now it's springtime and all the trees are coming out and the plants are coming up. So it says there's nature all around us. But that nature is actually the force, the capacity, the potential that is giving, that is allowing all this new life to burst forth. That's what the word nature actually originally meant for the Romans who first came up with it. It's interesting too that the Romans gave us our word material, which of course comes from mater, meaning mother. It's the same idea that we live in a world that is continually becoming, that natura naturans, a world that is continually bursting forth with new life. And that's what nature refers to. And the whole problem with the modern usage of the term is that we've kind of put the lid on that and assume that nature is down there. It's already there. It's what already exists. And then we add all this other stuff on top. So it's like we've taken this generative capacity of the world and sealed it up and said that's nature, that's what's given. And once we recognize or acknowledge that the real meaning of nature is this capacity of the world to bring forth, then we find that just about every other society in the world has a concept that corresponds precisely to that. That it's not a peculiarly Western invention at all, and that one can find equivalents in every other society we care to look at. So the argument that nature is a Western construct, that it doesn't really exist, completely falls down when we look at the deep history of the concept of nature itself. And I want to hang on to that because I think it's really when we're talking about life, this really is what the essence of life is: this capacity to bring forth, always to exceed itself. So I'm on a warpath now, trying to claim nature back after trying to get rid of it.
Is that the main focus of your work right now, or?
No, my work now is all over. Well, in a way, it is. I just, I mean, the last significant piece of work I did, which I finished in January or beginning of February, is a short book called The Rise and Fall of Generation Now. And it's actually a book about the way we think about generations and how we could perhaps think about generations differently. And this idea of the generation of life is rather central to it. So it does come in there. It's relating nature to natality, which is the power to give birth in the world. There's a wonderful book which everybody ought to read by the Roman author Titus Lucretius Carus, written around about 45 BC, I think, called The Nature of Things, in which he argues, well, never mind about his argument. It's a wonderful argument, and it's all written in a great long poem. But there he uses natura in precisely that sense. The generatrix, he calls it the mother. It's a generatrix is like a mother. The mother, the female, because it's a feminized word, the generatrix, and so it's a mother of all things that brings everything forth.
So at some point you have commented that a general theory of evolution was needed to face hard Darwinism. Do you think that the extended evolutionary synthesis could be that theory?
I think it only goes halfway. I mean, it's on the right track. That the fundamental problem with neo-Darwinism is that it puts development completely inside evolution. The development is is simply a kind of spin-off from more fundamental evolutionary processes in neo-Darwinism. So it's definitely a secondary thing. And what all these extended evolutionary synthesis, lots of different variants of it, but what they have in common is an attempt to rethink the relationship between evolution and development so as to give a bit more of a role to development, to balance it a bit. So it's not it's all evolution and then development as a kind of tail, but that both evolution and development have sort of interlock in a complicated way, but in which they have equal weight, and so different models in the EES, extended evolutionary synthesis, are trying to pose. They propose different ways in which in evolutionary processes and developmental processes interlock, and there are a number of different versions of it. None of them, to my mind, quite make it because they're still wedded to the evolutionary bit. I think we need to find an approach in which the distinction between evolution and development really doesn't make sense anymore. And the closest I've got to that, and the view that I find most attractive in currently available alternatives, is the so-called developmental systems theory proposed by Susan Oyama originally, and many others since, has this acronym DST, developmental systems theory, in which she's arguing that what evolves is a developmental system, and a developmental system has to be understood as a whole field of relationships. And think of an entire field of relationships and see that field as continually unfolding. And you see living organisms as sites or nexuses in that process of unfolding. Then evolution, as the unfolding of that field, is the same as development, or it's simply, you might say that developmental processes are simply localized instances of that evolutionary process as a whole. And that's the view that I'm inclined to take. And one implication of that is that we no longer have to drive a wedge between evolution and history. I mean, we often still say that the history is something that humans have, and it's distinct from evolutionary processes. I think if with a developmental systems theory perspective, we can understand history as a kind of local version or local instance of an evolutionary process that is going on throughout the organic world. But that evolutionary process is not one of descent with modification on Darwinian lines. It's not about inheritance and variation. It's about the unfolding of a field of relationships. So in that sense, one has to understand it sort of topologically rather than statistically. So that's where I am with that, and it's why I've argued that the one thing that is holding back a really radical synthesis is the continued appeal to processes of inheritance. And I think we have to get rid of the idea of inheritance that doesn't really make sense within biology. But that's a hard thing for biologists to take. Naturally, they're not too enthusiastic about the idea.
Do you have any suggestions on what we should replace inheritance with, or this idea?
Well, the word I suggested in a recent article in Current Anthropology called Evolution Without Inheritance, and the word I suggested is perdurance. It's not a common word in English, but where you see the the EES people, for example, the niche constructionists would say we have within generation processes of niche construction and between generation processes of inheritance. So they'd model the whole thing in terms of a kind of interaction of construction and inheritance. And their diagrams, construction is always horizontal and inheritance is vertical. I would replace those terms with production and perdurance. And perdurance means the way in which things carry on through time, through a continual process of becoming. And the example I gave in that paper was of just simply a farm. Imagine just an ordinary family farm. And you might say, well, that's a wonderful example of niche construction. You know, farmers really construct. When you clear the fields and build fences and everything, surely you're constructing a niche. And then you might say, and sure too, when one generation gives way to the next, the farm is inherited, isn't it? As a piece of landed property. But in practice, it's not like that at all. I mean, if you're of a farming family, you know you just have to keep on working those fields, keeping them in working order. And generations work together on the farm, or would traditionally have worked together on the farm, as new generations taking over as older people pass on, and therefore the longevity of the farm has got nothing to do with inheritance. It's got to do with the agricultural labor process and the way it's carried on through the collaboration of generations in practice. It might be different in law when they talk about land inheritance and so on, but in practice, if you want to keep that farm going, you have to work the fields year in, year out, and generations have to work together on it. And that's the way the farm is carried on. So that's what I mean by perdurance, rather than inheritance.
It's interesting because, I mean, what came to mind was essentially it's like bridging the debate between individual and group selectionists, because
we're beyond that, aren't we? I mean, there's a certain sociological naivety in this opposition of the individual and the group. I mean, at least in social anthropology, we've realized we've had for many decades, we've been developing what's called a relational approach, which shows how every person comes into being within a nexus of relations with others, and at the same time, through their actions, creates those relations. So every being is a relational entity, and I guess that's one of the reasons why, I like the fungi, because they are too. Then you think about the fungal you think of a person more like a fungal mycelium than a sort of wrapped up, self-contained organism. It's easier to imagine that, and think of life as this immense tangle of sort of web of relations, and of organisms continually coming into being within that web and renewing themselves as they go along. That's life.
So now, speaking specifically of culture, so transitioning a little bit from nature, so for some it would be a concept that only refers to transmission of information between generations. So when you talk about learning context, though, do you mean that culture is much more than just a simple transmission of information? And this doesn't matter if we're just talking about skills, languages, beliefs, or learning itself.
I don't know whether it really makes sense to ask what culture is, because then it's supposed that there's something out there that we want to just want to identify by this word. To my mind, culture, and this is what I tell students too, that culture is the name of a question, but it's not the answer. And the question is, why do people do things differently? Why are there these differences? I mean, we all know that, never mind about non-humans, but at least if we stick with humans for the time being, we all know that humans do things in incredibly different ways. That's obvious to everybody. And problem we're faced with is how to understand these differences. Why do they occur? How do they arise? I mean, these are the questions we're interested in. And we could say, okay, that question is the question of culture. The question is, why or how do people do things or think things differently? But that means that it's not the answer. If we say, oh, they do things or think things differently due to culture, then we're simply in a circle. It's a chicken and egg thing. Oh, we just say the question has become its own answer, and we haven't understood anything at all. We just said, basically, if we say it's due to culture, we're just saying, well, people do things differently because they do things differently, which doesn't get us anywhere. So then we need to understand, well, what's going on, and in order to understand what's going on, how it is that this person learns to do things this way and this other person learns to do things that way, then we're back into these questions about human development and how development occurs within fields of relationships. So we're back with these questions of ontogeny, which don't admit any distinction between what is biological and what is cultural, because we're simply concerned with the life and times of a human organism. It's obviously biological because we're talking about the life and times of an organism. It's cultural because these organisms are undergoing different trajectories of development. But that's it. There's no such thing, in my mind, as a culture, which can then be adduced as the explanatory source or the cause of things we're trying to investigate. And that's what's wrong with all these theories about cultural inheritance. They basically put the cart before the horse and suppose that somehow or other the information needed to carry out a certain form of life is transmitted in advance of the doing of it, which never happens and couldn't happen. There's an immense amount of circularity in this kind of evolutionary theorizing.
Right. And I guess it goes into, we're bound by how we have traditionally done things in terms of like categorizing everything, right? And so
yes, and it's true that that what tends to happen is that ways of modeling things become explanations. So you model something by and then you pretend that the model of some process actually becomes a model for it, and that it's a way of turning descriptions into explanations, and that's happening in biology all the time. But biologists get very annoyed if you tell them off for it. They're not used to the idea of critical thinking. I mean, I think that's what you go back to that first question of what drove me from science in the first place, drove me from science into anthropology, was actually there was no critical thinking in science, despite all the rhetoric about these scientists being terribly clever and thinking all these complex thoughts and the rest of it. There was absolutely no critical thinking, and the scientists had no idea how to do it because they weren't trained to do it. And when I went into anthropology, that was the first thing I had to learn.
Yeah, I remember some of my first anthropology classes, I would leave sometimes not, it was more of like a mental exercise was the class, right? So sometimes I would leave not fully understanding what was talked about, but feeling smarter in some way. Or
yes, I always say with anthropology to students that it should come with a health warning that you'll probably know less at the end of the year than you did at the beginning, because all these sorts of things that you thought you knew and took for granted turn out at least to be questionable or to rest on faulty assumptions. But that's great. I mean, how on earth can you have to kind of unwind things in order to wind them up in a different way. So that's exactly how it should be. But it's not the sort of, for people who are thinking that you're supposed to go to university in order to get the knowledge, you need, it's not always reassuring.
Yeah. Let's see. So, transitioning a little bit from some of the more intense questions, uh, something a little bit more relaxed. Could you tell us briefly a little bit about your current activities? And so, what does someone in your stature as an emeritus professor who has done decades of work contributing to anthropology and is still contributing to anthropology, how do you spend your time now that you're
Well, I retired in September 2018, so I'm now well into my 5th year of it, and um, and I've become basically an independent scholar. I've got used to so I was very fortunate that by the time the pandemic came, I've become quite accustomed to working from home and simply could get on with things. And it's been great. I mean, the retirement is, I've decided, is the best possible kind of research leave in that it's open-ended, it's fully funded, and I have no reporting requirements. I don't have to tell anybody what I do. So it's immensely liberating, and I've got a huge amount done. All these things that I've been able to catch up on writing, the things that I didn't have time to write whilst I was still an employee of the university, because you have all this other stuff to do. I mean, not just teaching, but running grants and applying for things and looking after people and so on. It's a full-time job, and everybody says that, and I know that as long as one's employed in the university, you can only do any research at weekends or during the holidays. Now I'm completely free to get on with my own stuff. I finished off my last PhD students just before Christmas, so I don't have that responsibility anymore. But I'm busier than ever. I mean, I'm really busy. I'm still working a 7-day week, and I get up in the morning and I work till the evening every day, and have, so long as I'm not traveling, I have quite a strict routine. I had to during the pandemic. I had to develop a routine. It kept one sane. That you had a very definite structure of the day, and you get up and work for a certain period, and then during that time, of course, one couldn't travel anywhere. So it was just that day in, day out. Now I'm back to traveling quite a bit more, but still, when I'm at home, I'm at my desk every day, and sometimes I find it jolly hard work. I mean, I think this whole retirement business is I sometimes think I wish I could work a little less hard, but I'm not very good at doing that. So, I'm basically just I didn't retire. I just carried on, but and as at first I felt a little lost, and was annoyed that the university seemed to have no interest in me anymore. And then until I realized that actually what that meant was that I no longer had any obligations towards the university, and I could do whatever I want. I didn't have to tell them what I was publishing or submit anything to anybody. And once I discovered that, I found it hugely liberating. It's like a weight off my shoulders. So, yeah, I'm now just getting on with things. I have a list of things to do, and I keep updating it. And as fast as I tick things off, other things come along, and I'm busy.
That's fantastic. Are you reading anything right now, or what's on your reading list right now?
I hardly have time to read anything. I'm writing mostly, and what am I? At the moment, I'm sort of in a bit of an odds and ends period. I finished that book that I mentioned about generations, and then I've had various sorts of essays to write. I keep getting these requests from artists, some famous, some not yet famous, to write pieces on their work if they got an exhibition coming up or something like that. And And I often do those because I find that it's fun to work with somebody you haven't worked with before, and it almost always gives you a new idea, which you can then think about. And so I've been busy with those sorts of things. Looking at my list here, well, what have I got to do? I'm in the middle of I'm co-editing a book with a couple of colleagues, Chris Simonetti and Michel Lousseau, a book called Urban Liquefaction, which is about cities and water in cities. So got to work on that. And a while ago, I was editing chapters for that. I've got to write a piece for a volume about Philippe Descola on the concept of nature. That's on my list of things to do. There's so many things that often I forget, and I think, what was I doing last week? And I can't remember anymore because I now go onto the next thing. But the long-term plan is to finish up with all this stuff and go back to fieldwork in Lapland that I left off over 40 years ago. I was doing fieldwork not with Sami people, but with Finnish people who were reindeer herders, forestry workers, and farmers up in the far north. And I was doing that fieldwork in 1979 to 80. And I got all my field notes, and I wrote a few articles, but I never wrote it up properly. And now it's over 40 years later, and I want to pick up from where I left off. And that's a kind of retirement project because it's not something you can do in a hurry or fit into a 6-month sabbatical. But I kind of owe it to the people there to write it up. So I'm hoping to get started on that later this year. But it might take me several years to finish.
That's awesome. That gives me hope that there's still time because I have some loose ends I wanted to finish up for my dissertation working with the communities down in Baja California, and there's a few things I didn't finish, and it's been bugging me, but it hasn't been 40 years. It's only been about
That's a thing.
it's only been about 7. So that's awesome. You're revisiting that.
Well, that's the plan. Yeah. I mean, at the time, I didn't get it written up properly because my head was turned by all sorts of other things. I was getting interested in all this theoretical stuff that had nothing to do with my fieldwork, and so I didn't really know what to do with it. So that's why I just put it to one side, and I don't know what I'm going to do with it now. We'll have to see. It's open as what will happen or what kind of book will emerge, but I must do something with it.
That's cool. I look forward to seeing what comes of that. Is Lapland beautiful? I bet it's beautiful.
Yeah, mostly it is, and there are nowhere's beautiful in November, but most parts of the year it's pretty nice. Yes.
That's awesome. We're nearing the end of the questions I had prepared. Do you have any other topics or any other messages you wanted to talk about or leave with the audience?
Well, I was going to ask you a question, and that's what is it like to live with a dinosaur? I can see behind you a dinosaur. I assume it's not alive, but it looks very impressive. And I was wondering where that came from. And
so I used to work at the Science Center in St. Louis, and I used to actually wear this costume and run around and play with kids and talk about evolution and dinosaurs and stuff. And they were going to throw it out. And I said, please don't throw it out. I'll take it. And so they kind of donated it to me. But now,
it's a dinosaur costume. You can wear it.
Yep.
Okay. Goodness.
But now my cat, it's a glorified cat tree now. So my cat lives in it basically now. And so.
Okay. Well, that's. I'm sure there's a paper that something that could be written there about the living dinosaur. that was the only question I had.
All right. Well, glad I could answer that for you. It is an Allosaurus, by the way. So, Yeah, just a little fun fact about that one. But that's all I had for today. I really appreciated talking with you. It was really you're a really awesome person. I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on everything. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to reading some more of your work.
My pleasure. Okay, so we're done. I'll say goodbye and hope all goes well. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
enjoy
We're
the
finished.
sun.